No one expected them to survive, not their commanders, not the enemy, not even themselves. 5 U.S. Marines were dropped into a remote valley in Afghanistan for what was supposed to be a routine patrol. Within hours, they were cut off, surrounded by over 100 Taliban fighters armed with RPGs, mortars, and overwhelming firepower. The outpost became a trap, a death box with no air support, no reinforcements, and no clear way out. They were outnumbered 20-1. Ammunition was running low. Every second was a choice between holding the line or being wiped out. What they did in the next 36 hours defied every rule of survival and rewrote the meaning of brotherhood. This is not a Hollywood script. There were no heroes in capes, just grit, instinct, and the will to protect each other at all costs. Most missions are designed to succeed. This one wasn't, but they didn't back down. The sun hung heavy over the mountains of Kunar province, casting a white heat that clung to everything it touched. The dust never settled. It floated constantly in the air like a thin veil, turning the world a dull shade of brown and gold. 5 U.S. Marines had arrived just before dawn, their boots hitting the dirt with mechanical rhythm, each of them carrying the weight of more than just their gear. They were a fire team assigned to Observation Post Echo, a remote outpost that overlooked a narrow valley known for insurgent traffic. It wasn't their first time in Afghanistan, but it was the first time the air felt this still, the silence this absolute. The mission briefing had been vague. Command had labeled the area low activity, no major threats detected, and no recent IEDs or direct engagements reported in the last month. They were told to hold the position for 48 hours, while the next unit completed their sweep of a nearby village. Their orders were simple: observe, report, and hold the line. The outpost itself was rudimentary. A semicircle of sandbags, a few trenches, an abandoned ANA, Afghan National Army structure riddled with old bullet holes. The hill it stood on provided a 270-degree view of the valley below. Beyond that, endless ridgelines of jagged rock and broken trees stretched in every direction. From the beginning, something felt wrong. The terrain was too quiet, the village too still. At night, the usual background noise, dogs barking, distant chatter, even the occasional echo of celebratory gunfire, was gone. There was no chatter on the local frequencies. The heat hung in the air like a warning. Even the birds were absent. The Marines moved methodically, setting up their positions, calibrating optics, checking lines of sight, and marking approach vectors. They didn't talk much. Their body language said enough. Each one of them had seen enough combat to recognize tension in the air. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. That unexplainable pull in the gut that said danger was close, just out of view. By the second evening, the sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. The temperature dropped sharply, and with it came a strange kind of silence. The kind that wrapped around you, that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise. The Marines sat in shifts, watching the darkness, scanning for movement. The NVGs flickered occasionally, glitching from dust and heat, painting the landscape in eerie green tones. Nothing moved, yet the tension remained, growing heavier by the hour. They started noticing subtle signs, trails of disturbed earth on the far ridge, a glint of metal where there should have been none, movement where goats never grazed. They logged everything, filed hourly reports, and updated command. There was no response, just radio static. Still, the protocol held. They dug in deeper, reinforced the sandbags, rationed water even though they had enough, rechecked weapon placements, reset trip flares and IR markers. Every task was executed with precision. They had been trained for worse, but training doesn't prepare you for the weight of waiting. The terrain around them offered little forgiveness. Rocky slopes and dry gullies made retreat impossible. The only viable exit was the way they had come, down the narrow switchback road that snaked behind the outpost, and that route could be cut off in minutes if ambushed. They were exposed on 3 sides, and they knew it. But no one said it out loud. Each of them processed the waiting differently. Some through silence, some by mentally rehearsing response drills, some by gripping their rifles a little tighter every time a shadow shifted. A kind of mental exhaustion began to set in, not from movement but from anticipation. Every sound carried potential, every second stretched. The rhythm of war had not yet started, but the prelude was deafening. The final straw came around 0400, just before first light. One of the Marines spotted movement at the edge of the tree line. Fast, coordinated, purposeful. Not animals, not villagers. No chatter, no flashlights. Just shadows where there hadn't been any seconds before. The kind of movement that signaled a plan, the kind that preceded something worse. He marked it in the log, then checked his watch. Still 2 hours till sunrise. Still no response from command. The wind picked up suddenly, cold and sharp, cutting through the sweat and dust. It carried the faintest echo, a sound they all recognized but couldn't yet place. The sound of people gathering, preparing, positioning. The sound of breath before the plunge. That's when they knew. They weren't alone, and they hadn't been for hours. Something was coming, and it would hit before the sun did. The first shots came without warning. No rallying cries, no distant echoes of movement. Just the sudden, shattering crack of gunfire that tore through the early dawn. It hit like a thunderclap, breaking the stillness that had pressed in on them for nearly 2 days. The rounds came in sharp bursts, precise and disciplined, slamming into the sandbags and ricocheting off the exposed steel of the observation post. Muzzle flashes lit up the tree line 200 meters out, and within seconds, the hill was alive with violence. The Marines dropped into position instinctively. Months of training collapsed into pure reaction. The machine gun opened first, its angry rhythm rattling through the bones of the outpost. The team leader swept the ridge with calm intensity, calling out enemy positions over comms that only echoed back static. There was no contact with the forward operating base, no air support, no reinforcements. Just the 5 of them on a dusty hill with nothing but dirt, instinct, and firepower. Enemy silhouettes darted between the trees, moving quickly, using the terrain to their advantage. They were coordinated, skilled. This wasn't a probing attack or an amateur ambush. This was a full assault, staged and intentional. Within minutes, the volume of fire doubled, then tripled. Bullets cut the air with a mechanical hiss, sending plumes of dust into the air around their heads. They could hear rounds snapping past their ears, could feel the sand and stone cutting into their faces as they hugged the ground. Adrenaline overrode fear. There was no time to feel anything but movement. One of the Marines shifted position to cover the eastern approach. He dropped prone behind a broken wall of cinder blocks and caught sight of at least a dozen figures moving uphill in staggered formation. Their dark outlines flickered through the trees like shadows with purpose. He fired short bursts, watching bodies fall, but they kept coming. More movement on the ridgeline, more bursts of fire. The enemy was trying to encircle the hill, and they were doing it fast. Grenades began to fall, some airburst, some skipping across the rock. The percussion shook the ground, sent vibrations through the soles of their boots and into their ribs. The blasts left ears ringing, turned comms into garbled noise. Dust clouded the optics, smoke drifted across the trenches. It was no longer a firefight, it was a storm. One Marine caught shrapnel in the shoulder. He didn't stop. Another had his cover shredded by an RPG that punched a hole into the northern wall of the post. Still, he held his ground. Every man understood what this was now. A stand. There was no falling back. There was nowhere to fall back to. Their only option was to hold the line. The volume of enemy fire ebbed and flowed like a wave, crashing against the outpost, retreating, then coming again with greater intensity. It was a tactic. Pressure, pause, flank, repeat. But the Marines didn't break formation. They rotated positions, passed ammo, patched wounds in the dirt. Every few minutes, another magazine emptied, another rifle heated past safe levels. Another breath was stolen by the concussion of impact, but no one looked away. No one hesitated. In the distance, the sun began to rise, casting orange and crimson light across the battlefield. The morning fog that had hung low in the valley began to burn off, revealing the true scale of the attack. Dozens, maybe more than 100, insurgents moved along the slope in a loose crescent, trying to pinch the defenders into a corner. They were dug in well, using centuries-old footpaths and stone outcroppings as cover. Some carried RPGs. Others had heavy-caliber support weapons. These weren't villagers or opportunistic fighters. This was an orchestrated offensive. Despite the chaos, the Marines held. They adjusted fire lanes, adapted. The SAW laid suppressive fire while the others picked off targets that moved between sectors. They counted shots without speaking, keeping mental inventory as belts ran low and magazines thinned out. One of them moved to the far left flank to retrieve more ammo from a secondary cache, crawling through dust and shell casings, his hands bloodied from climbing over the jagged earth. The enemy assault reached its peak around the 40-minute mark. They had pushed up the southern slope, reaching within 100 feet of the outer wall. A second RPG slammed into the hill just below the trench line, sending debris into the air. For a few seconds, visibility was near zero. The team used the moment to reposition. One Marine mounted the remaining machine gun on the broken sandbags and raked the slope with a wide arc of fire. The impact was immediate. Fighters fell, scattering, vanishing into the rock like insects exposed to light. Another wave came, this one more desperate, more erratic. A charge up the middle, screamed orders in Pashto. A burst of small arms fire so thick it sounded like a drum line. But the Marines, exhausted and bleeding, met it with fire and fury. There was no fear now, only survival. No room for doubt, no margin for error. As the sun rose higher, the tempo of the attack finally began to drop. The fighters that remained retreated into the tree line, dragging wounded and leaving behind bodies. The ground in front of the hill was littered with shell casings, craters, and blood-streaked rocks. Smoke curled up from spent weapons and shattered earth. The smell of cordite, sweat, and dust clung to everything. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The battle wasn't over, but they had survived the first wave. There would be more. They all knew it. The radio still sputtered static. Reinforcements had not arrived, but they were still alive. All 5 of them. For now, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to absorb every breath, every heartbeat. The outpost stood scarred and smoking, its defenses frayed, its edges splintered and torn by the morning's chaos. Dust still hung in the air, thick as fog, coating skin, gear, and lungs with a layer of grit that scratched from the inside out. The 5 Marines, though still upright, were different now. Their movements were slower, measured, no longer sharpened by adrenaline but dulled by exhaustion. Blood mixed with sweat, clinging to sleeves and pooling in the grooves of their hands. The echoes of the battle had not fully faded. They rang in their heads, shaping the silence into something unnatural. They were isolated, truly and absolutely. The radio continued to spit static no matter how many times it was reset, no matter how many times the frequencies were cycled. The satellite link was down, probably hit in the initial barrage, and there were no drone flyovers, no familiar mechanical whine in the sky to signal that someone, somewhere, still had eyes on them. They called out anyway, on every channel, repeating their unit designation and coordinates like a prayer. No one answered. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning haze, exposing every inch of their broken perimeter. The enemy had vanished into the terrain, but their presence lingered. Tracks in the dust, drag marks in the loose gravel. A makeshift firing position near the ridge still smoldered. No one said it aloud, but the truth was in every glance. They had been left behind. Whether by mistake or strategy, it no longer mattered. They were alone in a hostile valley, surrounded on all sides by fighters who had attacked with calculated purpose. There was no promise of rescue, no sign of movement from the rear lines. If they were to survive, it would be by endurance, not intervention. Fear crept in slowly, not with the sudden jolt of combat, but like a rising tide that filled the space around them. It settled in their bones, coiled in their guts, disguised as instinct. They checked their ammo again and again, cleaned weapons with shaking hands, surveyed the perimeter even when they knew every inch by heart. Each shadow was a threat, each gust of wind a whisper of danger. Their thoughts turned inward. What if the enemy was waiting? What if they came again tonight, stronger, more prepared? What if this was just the beginning? The physical toll deepened with every hour. 2 Marines had minor wounds, manageable but constant. A gash across the arm, a cracked rib from the shock of a blast. One was running a fever, his face pale beneath the grime. Their rations were intact, but the water was limited, and the heat grew more oppressive as the day wore on. No one truly rested. They took turns lying in the dirt, eyes open, rifles close, ears straining for signs of movement beyond the hill. The terrain that once gave them a strategic view now felt like a prison. They couldn't leave without exposing themselves, couldn't move without giving up their only defensible ground. Every decision became a calculation of risk. Every sound in the distance, a clatter of stone, the rustle of leaves sent pulses racing. They were hunted, even in stillness. The fear wasn't just of death. It was the fear of fading away without trace, of being written off as lost, of never being found. They thought of their families, the silence that might greet their names on some forgotten report. No heroism, no rescue, just a slow erasure in a war that had already consumed so many. Each man buried that fear deep, armored it with resolve, but it was there. Always. They looked out over the valley and saw not just the enemy, but the possibility that no one was coming. As the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretched across the landscape. The light turned amber and soft, but it brought no comfort. Instead, it marked the countdown to night, the time when the enemy could move unseen, when their advantage disappeared into the dark. The Marines prepared silently, reinforcing positions with trembling hands, checking every angle, every corner. The sandbags were torn and uneven, the trench shallow and dry. Still, they worked. They couldn't afford to hope, only prepare. Their minds began to turn against them in the quiet. Fatigue played tricks. Shapes in the distance, phantom footsteps in the brush, echoes where there were none. They second-guessed every sound, questioned every instinct. The idea of sleep became foreign. Every blink felt dangerous. The fear was no longer of a single moment, a single attack. It was the fear of the endless unknown. When would the next assault come? Would they hear it before it began? Would it be sudden, or would it bleed in slowly, the way isolation had? They sat in the dirt as night approached, 5 shapes in the dying light, all covered in the same dust, all breathing the same stale air. They didn't speak. They listened, for movement, for radio calls, for anything. But the only thing that came was the wind, dry and thin, moving across the valley like a whisper of something forgotten. In the dark, their thoughts returned to the morning. The roar of the ambush, the chaos, the precision. They remembered how close it had come, how few inches stood between survival and death. And they knew, without needing to say it, that it would come again. That this was not over. That they were living inside the pause between attacks. And in that pause, isolation was the loudest sound of all. The darkness wrapped around the hill like a shroud, deeper and more oppressive than the night before. There were no stars, only a low shifting ceiling of clouds that blotted out the moon and turned the world into a blur of silhouettes and whispered movements. The temperature dropped with the light, the dry desert heat giving way to a cold that cut through sweat-soaked uniforms and made every breath sharp. The Marines barely moved. Eyes scanned the black beyond their perimeter, fingers hovering near triggers, every sense straining for the one sound that would mark the beginning of another wave. The silence no longer meant safety. It was the prelude to something worse. Steve and Jenkins sat at opposite ends of the southern flank, the most vulnerable slope, where the enemy had nearly breached during the initial assault. The trench line here was barely deep enough to provide cover, and the sandbags were scorched and falling apart. Steve, the more seasoned of the two, kept his position locked forward, watching the tree line through night-blurred optics. Jenkins, younger and quieter, monitored the flank, his rifle steady despite the tremble in his fingers. They'd exchanged no words, just glances and nods, a silent agreement that this was their line and they would hold it. At 3:41, the silence broke. It started with a faint, deliberate snap, a twig underfoot, unnaturally timed, too clean to be wildlife. Then came the soft crunch of boots against loose gravel, followed by the glint of movement. Brief, almost imagined, but enough. Steve opened fire first, his muzzle flash lighting the trench like a strobe, revealing shapes just 20 yards down the slope. Shadows exploded into motion, ducking and weaving through the brush. Jenkins was already firing by the time the first return shots came, rounds cracking overhead and digging into the dirt behind them. The ambush was tight, compact, focused on overwhelming this exposed section. Fighters came in low, fanning out, laying down suppressive fire while a second group advanced behind the first. Jenkins dropped back a few feet to reload, then popped up again, firing in 3-round bursts as tracers sliced through the air. Steve, pinned against a broken corner of the trench, laid down cover fire, yelling for the others over the radio, though the line was choked with static and partial signals. Reinforcements from the other side of the post would take time. Too much time. When an RPG streaked in from the left and exploded near the trench wall, everything went white. Jenkins came to first, his ears ringing, the world around him tilting and swaying as if underwater. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, blinding one side. Steve was sprawled against the opposite wall, dazed but conscious, his helmet cracked, face streaked with dust and blood. The trench was nearly flattened. One of the machine guns was destroyed, and the southern edge was breached. Through the haze of smoke, figures moved closer. 5, maybe 6 fighters, rifles raised, advancing fast. Without a word, Steve pulled himself upright, firing from the hip, each shot calculated, disciplined. He screamed over the gunfire, pointing to a crate of grenades partially buried beneath the rubble. Jenkins understood instantly. While Steve held the line, Jenkins crawled through the broken trench, dragging the crate free. He opened it with bloody fingers and began hurling the grenades one after another down the slope. The explosions threw dirt and shrapnel into the sky, halting the advance and forcing the fighters to scatter. One grenade landed squarely in the center of the approaching group, the blast tearing through them and sending bodies flying. It bought seconds, maybe more. But the enemy regrouped quickly, shifting around the right side in an attempt to flank. Steve saw it first, and without hesitation climbed over the lip of the trench, exposing himself to fire. He sprinted low and fast to the ridge where the machine gun nest had once stood, and re-established a firing position using only a damaged saw and the edge of a broken sandbag wall. He opened up again, drawing the attackers' attention, forcing them to redirect their fire toward him and away from Jenkins. Jenkins, using the distraction, repositioned and picked off fighters one by one, reloading with shaky hands, forcing his rifle to stay steady. But the weight of the moment began to press down. Steve was pinned again, his position lit up with tracer fire. He screamed into the radio, ordering Jenkins to fall back, to get to cover, to move now. But Jenkins didn't. He stayed. He turned his fire to the ridge, covering Steve in return, drawing fire from the other side now. The two of them, exposed and outnumbered, created a killing field through sheer force of will. Minutes passed in chaos, but eventually the enemy began to break. Not all at once, first in pairs, then larger groups, retreating into the darkness beyond the ridge. By the time the first of the other Marines reached the southern trench, the fight was already over. The ground was littered with shell casings, broken gear, and the bodies of at least 9 enemy fighters. Smoke still clung to the ground. Steve sat propped against the ruined wall, blood seeping from his shoulder. Jenkins lay flat in the trench, his chest heaving, eyes wide and unfocused. Neither man had spoken once. There had been no time for words, only decisions. In the aftermath, while the others tended to wounds and rechecked the defenses, the gravity of what had happened began to settle over them. Steve's actions had drawn the bulk of the assault away from the line, giving Jenkins the opening to repel the flank. Jenkins, refusing to fall back, had risked everything to keep the hill from being overrun. They hadn't saved the entire post. They had saved a few minutes, maybe. But in that place, in that moment, those minutes were everything. Their hands were shaking when it ended, their uniforms torn, their faces blank. But they were still alive, and the line still held. Dawn approached slowly, not with a burst of light, but as a dim, colorless smear on the horizon. The sky remained choked with smoke and dust, and the sun rose unseen behind thick clouds, casting only a dull gray over the valley. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The outpost was barely standing. Its perimeter was mangled and patched with scorched debris, its trenches collapsed in places, weapons damaged or jammed, and its defenders utterly exhausted. They moved like ghosts now, their faces hollow, eyes red and vacant from sleeplessness and the trauma of the hours before. Their bodies obeyed out of habit, driven by survival, not strength. Jenkins hadn't spoken since the fight. Steve's shoulder was bandaged in layers of torn fabric. The bleeding slowed, but not stopped. The others took turns walking the perimeter, stepping over rubble and blood-soaked earth, scanning the valley for signs of motion. The fear had not faded. It had only evolved into something deeper, a cold resignation, a sense that the worst was still coming. They didn't need intel or a radio transmission to know it. They felt it. The enemy had tested them, prodded their defenses, broken parts of them and retreated, always methodically, never in panic. It was a pattern: pressure, withdrawal, regroup, strike harder. The pattern had not ended. It was only waiting for its final act. The 5 Marines, scattered along the remains of their positions, prepared in silence. Ammunition was divided again. Grenades placed in easy reach. Wounded limbs tied tighter. No one asked how long they could hold. They simply accepted the truth. Whatever came next would be everything. The first sign was the ground. It began with faint vibrations, rhythmic and growing stronger by the second. Not an explosion. Movement. Dozens of footsteps. Then, far in the distance, shapes began to emerge. Not scattered shadows this time, but a line, wide and dense, moving in coordinated waves. Fighters in numbers they hadn't seen before, spreading along the ridge like a tide, descending the slope with purpose. It wasn't an ambush. It wasn't even a raid. It was an overwhelming assault. designed not to probe, but to crush. They came in waves, three-pronged, with machine gunners in the rear and rifles at the front, supported by mortars lobbed from behind the tree line. The first mortar hit the western trench, already weakened, and collapsed it entirely. The second dropped near the center of the outpost, throwing a cloud of dirt and rock into the sky. The 5 Marines didn't scatter. They couldn't. They spread their fire across the line, forcing their weapons to cycle again and again, barrels glowing red, triggers locked into a rhythm of resistance. Jenkins found a new firing position beneath a half-collapsed wall. Steve, refusing any rest, dragged himself back to the ridge line, his saw braced against shattered stone. They dropped dozens of attackers in the first 10 minutes. The terrain became a killing field again, torn with bullets and grenade shrapnel. But this time the enemy didn't retreat. For every fighter who fell, 2 more came behind him. Their voices rose into a chilling, constant chant, echoing across the valley, drowning out the gunfire. The Marines began to fall back in inches. One was hit in the leg, pulled behind cover by the others. Another nearly lost his arm to a blast that tore the weapon from his grip. There were no medics now, no real cover. Only scraps of defense, twisted metal, broken sandbags, and instinct. The enemy breached the eastern line at 6:12. A group of 10 made it over the berm and into the trench system before being cut down at close range. The fight turned into a frenzy. Close quarters, hand-to-hand, rifles swinging like clubs when bullets ran dry. Jenkins used a combat knife more than once. Steve ran out of ammo and picked up an enemy rifle, jamming another magazine into the unfamiliar weapon with shaking fingers. Every inch of the outpost became a battleground. Grenades exploded within yards. Smoke filled the air so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It was chaos, and it was ending. Then came the turning point, unseen, unplanned, but undeniable. Jenkins, crawling through the ruined trench with 2 magazines left and blood streaming from his arm, reached the emergency comms crate. It had been buried under debris since the first assault. Long forgotten. Inside, a backup beacon, damaged but intact. He activated it without hesitation. The light blinked weakly. No promise of signal, no confirmation. But he activated it anyway and kept fighting. Minutes passed. More fighters poured in. The Marines, down to their last rounds, prepared for a final stand. One collapsed behind the trench wall, unconscious from blood loss. Another was blinded temporarily from a blast to the face, firing wildly in every direction. Steve took 2 rounds to the vest and barely got up. Jenkins stayed close to him, firing at shadows, dragging him backward with one arm while defending with the other. The outpost was no longer a defensive position. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. And then from the sky, the sound returned. Distant at first, a hum, almost missed in the roar of gunfire. Then louder, distinct, a familiar rhythm. Rotors, helicopters. The shape of 2 Black Hawks materialized through the smoke, flanked by the shimmering silver of an A-10 circling high above. The airstrike came first, clean and terrifying, shredding the enemy's rear with precision. The rotors kicked up a storm of dust and debris, and the remaining attackers scattered, retreating as quickly as they had come, now disoriented and panicked. Rescue had come. Too late for comfort, but not too late. As boots hit the ground and medics poured from the helicopters, the Marines didn't cheer. They didn't collapse in relief. They simply stopped, bodies frozen in place, weapons still clenched, eyes wide with disbelief. Jenkins was the last to stand down, lowering his rifle slowly, blinking through blood and ash. Steve lay beside him, barely conscious, whispering words no one heard. They had held the line. They had endured the impossible. And they had survived. The dust had not yet settled when the last helicopter lifted from the shattered outpost. Its rotors stirred the broken earth, sending loose dirt and torn scraps of canvas into the air as the horizon blurred with light. In the growing morning heat, the silence that followed was heavier than any barrage, a vacuum where gunfire had once ruled. The outpost, once a small but stubborn mark of resistance, was now a skeletal ruin of charred beams, collapsed trenches, and empty shell casings. Bodies had been recovered, both American and enemy, lined beneath tarps or marked by fading strips of cloth. The ground bore scars that would outlast memory. Everything smelled of smoke, of burned metal and blood turned dry under the sun. In that broken place, history had been carved in pain. The 5 Marines who had stood the final defense were no longer at the hill. Medics had stabilized the wounded, loaded them with care, and rushed them to a forward operating base where tents flapped under a hot wind and distant radios crackled with reports of skirmishes elsewhere. Time blurred in recovery. Days passed, then a week. They slept little, ate in silence. Some wounds were visible, stitched arms, broken ribs, bruised lungs. Others lingered deeper, hidden behind vacant stares and long moments of stillness when the noise in their heads refused to fade. Steve's shoulder had been repaired with metal and screws. He moved with the stiffness of someone who had given more than he could afford. Jenkins, though mostly healed, flinched at sudden sounds, his grip on routine fragile and easily broken. Outside their ward, the war continued. Patrols left at dawn and returned at dusk. Convoys rolled out in clouds of sand, and distant thunder from artillery never truly stopped. But within the perimeter of the aid station, the five became symbols, not by choice, but by necessity. Reports were written, commendations discussed. Officers arrived to shake hands and pose for photographs. Journalists pressed for statements. None of the Marines spoke much. The story was told without their words, shaped by after-action reports and second-hand details, molded into something clean and proud, something people far from the battlefield could understand. Eventually, they were pulled from the front. One by one, orders came. Transfers to safer posts, rotations home, evaluations for post-traumatic stress. Jenkins returned to a base in North Carolina, where pine trees whispered instead of rifles, and the air no longer smelled of dust and war. Steve was sent west, to a rehabilitation center tucked between desert hills, quiet and removed. The others scattered across states and stations, connected only by a series of shared memories no one outside their circle could fully grasp. Each carried pieces of the hill with them, not the soil, but the weight. The knowledge of what had happened, what they had done, what they had lost. The military did not forget. In time, medals came. Steve received the Silver Star for valor under fire. Jenkins was honored with the Navy Cross. Letters arrived in clean envelopes with official seals, words like gallantry and heroism etched in formal tone. Ceremonies were held, uniforms pressed, speeches made. And yet, the truth of the hill lived elsewhere, in dreams, in moments of silence, in long drives with the radio off, in the way their eyes darkened when someone asked about Afghanistan. Years passed. The war shifted, then ended, at least on paper. Headlines moved on. New crises, new conflicts. The outpost, once contested ground, was left to time. Nature returned in creeping brush and wind-shaped stone. No one patrolled its ridges. No new Marines dug fresh trenches. But the bones remained, hidden beneath layers of time, fragments of helmets, metal shrapnel buried in the soil, the faded impression of boots long since gone. There were no monuments on that hill, only memory. Jenkins visited once. He made the trip alone, months after his discharge, flying commercial into Kabul, then hiring a local driver who asked no questions. The drive was long, the roads uneven, but he found the spot without a map. It had not changed much. The terrain was the same. Barren, wide, silent. He stood at the ridge where Steve had braced his saw and looked down the slope where the enemy had come. For a long time, he said nothing, did nothing. He simply stood. Then from his pack, he pulled a single object, a battered rifle sling, frayed at the edge, and laid it gently on a flat stone. He left it there and walked back without looking over his shoulder. Steve never returned. He didn't need to. For him, the hill was always present, in the tilt of his spine, in the ache of his shoulder when it rained, in the hollow behind his eyes. He spent time speaking with new recruits, not about tactics or medals, but about fear, about what it meant to hold when everything said to run. He rarely told the full story. When he did, it wasn't for attention. It was for those who had never been there, to remind them that courage wasn't loud or clean. It was raw, ugly, painful. It was staying when logic screamed to go. The five never served together again. But every year, on the same day, they called one another. No words about the past, just a voice, a moment, a confirmation that they were still here, still breathing, that the line they held so long ago still meant something. In some room, in some archive, the battle was reduced to paragraphs and maps, an operation with a name, a location, a conclusion. But for the five who lived it, it remained unwritten, etched instead in scars and silence, in midnight stares and hands that shook when no one was watching. They had held the line, and though the world moved on, they never truly left it. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you found this story interesting, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.